Thank you so much for joining me today. Why don't we just start? I would love to hear about your inspiration for the book, how you came to write it, and how long you to use a little bit of a birth metaphor, kind of bore it before it was born into the world.
So the book really began after the birth of my first child, unsurprisingly. That was the event that really attuned me to the subject and got me interested in it. And, when I went through that experience, I felt like it was not only one of the most meaningful and hardest experiences I had been through, it was also to me the most interesting. It was just very interesting. And as a staff member at a university at the time, had a very short um, leave, and then I was back at work and came back to the business of publishing books and working on books and coming up with ideas and kind of constantly scanning the marketplace and thinking about what was being published and getting noticed and what wasn't. And it was just very striking to me that there just wasn't much on birth being published at that time, at least not in a very visible way.
Mm.
Most of what I was seeing um, what I or at least what I was really noticing were books on death. There was a lot of books on the bestseller list, books winning major prizes, books coming through Yale Press, where I was an editor and still am an editor. Books that I published on death, so I was part of this too. And I believe at that time the most popular course on the Yale campus was a philosophy class on death. So it was striking to me that you had undergraduates who were far from the experience of death still lining up to take a course on it, to think through it. But I just wasn't seeing anything like that on birth. So it really began as, this book should exist. And then there were a few years of trying to pitch it to other people and, why don't you write this book? And no one wanted to do it. And, almost with any idea I've come up with over the years,
Mm.
there's usually someone who it connects with. And so that was interesting to me, that no one wanted to do it. And, the book started to grow in my own mind, and I was just collecting things as things were coming across my desk and as I was just observing the culture and reading. So it happened pretty slowly. The book came out when my first child was 14, about 14.
Mm.
So it was 14 years between having that first idea and then, the book emerging into the world. And so the whole time I wasn't actively writing it or researching it, but I think it was there kind of in the back of my head.
Mm.
And yeah, just kind of shaped by both my experiences having children, raising them, but also observing the culture, reading and editing books.
Mm.
And yeah, just kind of was a constant topic of interest and obsession.
Mm.
Even I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was always there.
Mm. It's interesting to hear about how prevalent that topic of mortality was. I feel mildly sensitive to it since my PhD was, in fact, on works of art that were created to help people prepare for death. But
Mhm.
as I was actually writing my own book, I I dipped my toe into works of art that were supposed to spiritually prepare people for birth. And there are a few because as you kind of point out in this book, birth is this experience. We have all been born, and many people, many women will have the experience of giving birth. And so it makes sense that there are these works of art that also deal um, with giving birth and being prepared for that. I was particularly compelled by a medieval, it was a charm, but it's basically just a prayer that's the woman kind of talking to the baby and telling it to not be troublesome and to come out and to come forth like Lazarus comes forth in the tomb. So anyway, that's an aside, but that is just really fascinating how, as you note, this we will all die, but for most of us
Mhm.
who are walking around a university campus or working on an editorial, that experience is distant, whereas our fact of being born is the most kind of immediate and important at this stage in our life. And so your book beautifully takes up this idea of natality perhaps in contrast to mortality. And the way that you do that is by kind of providing these I like to think them as kind of intellectual portraits of several different thinkers and how they kind of considered and wove birth into their way of thinking. And those are Hannah Arendt, Friedrich Nietzsche, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley, Sojourner Truth, Adrienne Rich, and Toni Morrison. And I think for anyone who has kind of a intellectual interest or enjoys history, there is this kind of element both of the historical and the philosophical and the way that they thought, but also the way that their lives were shaped by birth. But perhaps a good place to start is with Hannah Arendt, who, of course, she kind of has the most developed, or at least the most famous theory of natality. So tell us a bit about Hannah Arendt and her idea of natality. And yes, we'll begin there.
Yeah, I mean, I began the book with her. She is the focus of the first chapter, partly because she was the one who gave me that word natality. I had not, I had noticed the absence of a concept, but I didn't have a language for it. And so part of what she gave me was a language for it. And so this was a concept or a phrase that she coined. She uses it first, or at least in the published works, it's in the human condition. But she had been interested in birth from early on in her career. She was, of course, a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust from Germany, had fled Nazi Germany, and had spent 18 years as a stateless person, and then had arrived in the U.S. Had trained actually in theology, although she kind of, I think, would have thought of herself maybe at that point more as a philosopher, but had turned against philosophy, seeing the ways that different philosophers, including um, her teacher Martin Heidegger, and former lover, had been part of the Nazi regime, and she had turned to politics. So her work kind of straddles, these different areas of, I think of kind of between politics and philosophy. I still think of her as a philosopher, and some people don't. But it is a pretty highly theorized version of natality. In many ways, it's more, it kind of works at a higher theoretical level than some of the other thinkers in the book, for whom birth is more kind of biological and rooted in the body. But for her, birth was connected with action, and birth was political in the sense that by virtue of our having been born, we can act, we can begin new things. We are beginners, and beginning is um, political in the sense that once we act, she makes a distinguish between that and labor,
Mm,
which for her, she makes this kind of hard distinction, which is sometimes hard to maintain.
mm,
Um, but this is really about, I think, her having survived the Holocaust and witnessing in Nazi Germany during, under a totalitarian regime, how people had begun to believe that they couldn't act. They couldn't
mm,
begin new things. It was this kind of pervasive cynicism that had set in, and she saw this as incredibly destructive.
mm,
That, once people believe they can't do anything, I think we see this in our own era. There's this cynicism, the sense that you can't change things. Things are just so far gone, nothing can be done. And for her, that was really dangerous. And so by bringing us back to birth, she's kind of bringing us back to that beginning. And like, I would say creativity. She uses creativity less than she uses the word action.
mm,
But for me, it's about that kind of creative capacity that we all have.
mm. Yes, and that was such a needful message at that time and in our own. It's interesting though, because one of the other figures that you talk about kind of famously has this critique of Arendt. And I want to say one of the things I enjoyed about your book is just a little detail, but you'll often kind of tie a thread between when one character is born, and so like in the beginning of Adrienne Rich's, you talk about how she's born in the year when Virginia Woolf's In a Room of Her Own came out, and you often kind of draw these connections between all these thinkers throughout time, even though but the biographies are not in chronological order. You don't have one and then another, but there's this kind of sense of their wovenness. But
Mhm.
Adrienne Rich, and I'm realizing that I've never actually heard her name said out loud, even though I've read it. Um, so I'm questioning myself whether it's Adrienne or Adriana. But she was a poet and a writer, And she famously kind of pans Arendt's, which book is it that she pans? I'm just forgetting now.
The Human Condition.
Yes, so the one you were just talking about. Um, Kind of for being too zoomed out, too abstract, because Rich wants to place the importance of birth, it's also important for Rich, in the body. So, and
Mhm.
she kind of talks about, a famous phrase is the personal is political. So tell us a bit about Rich's critique of Arendt and how Rich thinks about birth.
Yeah, so as I hinted at, Arendt makes this distinction between labor and action, and birth and reproduction. So reproduction would be connected to labor, which is just
Mm,
about, the kind of ongoing cycle of
mm,
nature. Things come into being, they die, and it's this cycle. It's regenerative, but it's also can potentially be seen as a trap. You're just
mm,
stuck in it. And for her, action and birth were more about the breaking of the cycle. So this did draw inspiration from the Gospels, from the story of Christ as this kind of radical rupture and this new beginning that is not even about what began before. I think this is where Arendt is a little bit hard because she also is very interested in transit traditions as I guess, a form of ancestry. She doesn't tend to use
mm,
that word as I don't believe. Um, but she does root people in traditions, but she's also
mm,
really interested in this break in the tradition where this new thing comes forth. So I Rich's critique is that she reads the human condition, and so all of these things that are connected with biological reproduction and the labor of the body, about
mm,
feeding itself, reproducing itself, human waste. These are things that for Arendt are not part of the political realm. They are part
mm,
of, their home. They're to be kept private. This is
mm,
not about politics. This is not about human plurality. This is about um, this is not about a kind of shared human world that we create together. Those are separate. And what Rich, I think, rightly understood is that these were women's activities. These were not just women, but very often mothers who were doing this kind of work of, changing diapers and making meals and scrubbing dishes and cleaning. And to say that that work wasn't political
mm,
and kind of had no place in the political realm really strips women of any kind of political status or recognition or role. And so I think the second wave feminists were reacting not even against Arendt's depiction there, but also just more generally about these histories of being kind of stuck in the home and their work not being acknowledged. And I think,
mm,
most of us can understand that critique well. I think that, it was a little hard for me to say that one of them had it all right.
mm,
I think that what Hannah Arendt was doing in the human condition was still working through the Holocaust, and her subject was totalitarianism. It was
mm,
trying to understand how these genocidal regimes had come into being. Um, she didn't really write about motherhood really at all. She wasn't a mother herself. She never had
mm,
children. Um, she didn't see herself as a feminist. She kind of rejected almost all of these kinds of labels and ideologies. She was very suspicious of them. I think often for good reason. At the same time, I think she kind of missed the opportunity to be part of these
mm,
amazing conversations that were going on at the time and to engage with some of the people that were at the forefront of them. And some of it was generational. She was
mm,
old enough to be our Rich's mother,
mm,
and you see this kind of one generation. The differences is a
mm,
kind of overturning of Arendt's generation that was going on. Um, I also think, though, that part of what Arendt understood is that we were entering this period of mass surveillance and of all aspects of our private lives were going to be opened up
mm,
and made part of the public sphere. And in a weird way, there are certain parts of Arendt's insistence on the boundaries of the private realm that
Mm,
would have protected certain kinds of rights that, you know, I mean, there's all kinds of ways this could have been worked out differently, but I think it was part of the idea that all aspects of our lives and our bodies are kind of, you know, public,
mm,
that can lead into, you know, situations that those second wave feminists certainly um, didn't hope for.
mm. That's a really helpful kind of description of both of them, and I
Mhm.
think Rich is a really good example of when you're talking at the beginning about, how would our politics, our poetry, our kind of personal development and spiritual thought be different if we didn't have this kind of continual reminder of thinking about death, which is something that is a long history, but instead thinking about birth. And one of the
Mhm.
things that I kind of love about Rich's perspective is that attention not just to kind of grand moments, but to maintenance and to care.
Mhm.
That it's not just the child being born, it's the child that is nursed and has their diaper changed. And I
Yeah.
think attention to that question of care and maintenance is a really interesting one that birth kind of brings into focus.
Certainly. I mean, it's so much of the work that's entailed in bringing a new person into the world is very deeply biological birth. This is why my own understanding of birth is much more biological than Arendt's was. Not to say that hers wasn't at all rooted in biology, but in many ways, I think I'm more sympathetic to these cycles, to believe that we're
Mm,
actually deeply immersed in nature, and part of what we're involved in are these cycles that aren't very different than the rest of the world's
mm,
seasonal changes and births and deaths around us. Um, yeah, I mean, I think some of the other thinkers in the book, you know, Toni Morrison, so much of what she writes
mm,
about is, you know, inside kitchen, and you're in kitchens, and she has
mm,
amazing cooking scenes.
mm,
I haven't ever really heard anyone talk about. I'm sure this has been written about somewhere, but there's a lot of cooking in her books,
mm,
a lot of food preparation and feeding and eating.
mm,
Um, and I think that you know, I mean, women who have had to do that kind of work have written about it really
mm,
amazingly. I mean, this is part of what we've gotten with this maybe last generation, which has been, I think, more memoir focused. I've
mm,
been a lot of really incredible, just personal stories about, you know, trying to do this work, sometimes hating it, sometimes loving it, you know, just figuring it all out, and what it's actually like to, you know, what the work is, and to be real about it. And um yeah, yeah. So I'm really drawn to those
mm,
accounts. I
mm,
also really liked that Arendt gives this larger map, helps us
mm,
think at like a higher level of, when we look down at, you
mm,
know, the kind of history of human civilization, what role has birth played?
mm,
And to, you know, part of the ambition of the book was to connect those things, for us to have the theory, and for us to have the practice, you know, to have the
mm,
kind of high view, but then to attend to the details too.
mm. So this reminds me of one of the chapters which I found really moving, which is about Sojourner Truth. And something
Mhm.
that's interesting to me in that chapter is also the kind of ambivalent nature of that care, that in some sense that it is this incredibly important and nourishing thing, but that in society it often has been kind of considered, according to Arendt's view, as labor, right? That it's something that is
Mhm.
unimportant. And that in Sojourner Truth's life, she was, of course, a woman who was born enslaved, had 5 children. I think she earned her she was made free before her husband and her children, and then went on to be an evangelist and an important figure in the abolitionist movement. But you could see kind of the ambivalent nature of care and birth in her life, because in some
Mhm.
senses, she writes about how birth was, to benefit the master, that it created more property and value for them. And in that way, it's quite negative. And yet she still maintains birth as a positive beautiful thing in the way that she preaches and talks about freedom after she is freed. And that language of even her early life of care being this kind of precious and important thing in the midst of a great deal of just suffering and injustice. So yes, tell us a bit about kind of how she thought about birth.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about all of this kind of work is that we can have whatever attitude want about it, but on some level, it has to be done. This
Mm,
is like, we're at this moment of as a culture where a lot of our thinking has kind of evolved beyond it,
mm,
but we're still in these bodies that really haven't changed that much, since whatever millions of years. And we still need to eat, we still need to sleep. We have these basic biological needs that need to be met. And so how are those met? And I think that we look at Rich was an account of 20th century woman doing that work herself. She also had help.
mm,
She had the means to get help with that work.
mm,
Um, but it with truth, we see um, a very different version of that, where not
mm,
only the work of like farming, she was actually doing farm labor,
mm,
and then house labor as well, but actually the work of birthing becomes um, a kind of function of performing labor for someone else,
mm,
creating bodies who are supposed to in turn become laborers. And birth is that is part of the history of birthing, and we have to
mm,
look at that. So I really wanted in the book to not have some like highly sentimentalized version
mm,
of birth. All the people in the book, I think, were hugely interested in the subject, thought it was just this incredibly rich and important and meaningful
mm,
experience, and derived all kinds of meanings from it. But they also show us that this history has not always been easy,
mm,
especially for women, and especially for women for whom birthing was separated from something like motherhood. It
mm.
was those things were split apart in a lot of slave communities. So yeah, that's, I think, a very important thing for us to look at, partly because I think not just because it's so exceptional, but that because it raises questions and it attunes us to things that are still part of birth in our world today.
Mm.
Still questions about um, inequality, about the labor we do for other people.
Yeah, and what I really appreciated about that chapter was the way in which, especially through her life, you can kind of see those ambivalences and the nature of there being unjust. Her experience of birth was surely one that was not entirely positive, and yet in her writing, she still maintain and in her voice kind of that we receive through her amanuensis, there is still a sense of it being significant and important, that even kind of the unjust experiences she has within that doesn't negate or draw away the importance of birth. Um, as I was reading the book, I I was reading it over the period when my oldest niece just turned 6, and when my sister was pregnant with her, she was doing a degree that was largely concerned with kind of modern philosophy in the 18th century, 18th, 19th century. And she was very, very with child. And she kept on saying to me, I think that these philosophers would be so different if they weren't mostly, single men who had never born a child. um,
Yeah.
which I think this book is a wonderful kind of attempt to begin a different conversation. But I did think your second philosopher is in fact one of those great offenders, one of the 19th century men who never bore a child. So tell us about why
Yeah.
you included Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yes, this is a question I always get. So I mean, I part of why I read him is to understand Arendt better
Mhm,
originally. Um, I think part of her critique of, this comes in Origins of Totalitarianism. It's her first book that she writes when she, um, settles into life in New York, and it becomes probably her most famous book. And she says that, the death drive that we saw in the Nazi regime was not actually something that was very new. She saw this as
Mm,
very deep rooted in the history of Western thought. And I think she was building partly off of Nietzsche and others, but this was part of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, but of also just of Western thought, is that it had become so focused on getting into heaven, and of death as the, okay, this is the
mm,
chance to escape from life. Obviously, there are all kinds of Christian thinkers who have not had that kind of approach to the tradition. But he was critiquing at least that that aspect of the tradition as he had encountered it, and trying to kind of return us to life
mm,
itself. And I think for what Nietzsche was most interested in was life. How do we live our lives and accept our lives? And he talks about the yesayer. How do we become the yesayers? How do we say yes to everything that comes our way, whether it's suffering? He dealt with all kinds of sicknesses, loneliness, and failure, professional failure. And I think in his own life, he had this practice of just saying yes. How do I accept this and celebrate life with all of it, all that it brings. His idea of the eternal return was, if someone came and told you you're going to be reborn over and over again, how would you see that as good news? What kind of life? How could we think of life, and how could we lead our lives with where that would come as good news? Um, and so what he ends up doing, because he's so interested in life itself, but also in creativity, is that he understands that this is birth. This is like the
mm,
creation of new life. It's sort of in the Nietzschean worldview, the creation of new life is sort of the apotheosis of everything he's writing about. And yet he's there as this single man who is sick, losing his mind, lonely,
mm,
a failure in love, and he can't get into the experience
mm,
biologically. Not only can he not give birth himself, and he writes about male motherhood and about
mm,
men being pregnant and about himself being pregnant, but he can't have that experience. He also can't be a part of it as a father because he doesn't have a partner. And so
mm,
it's just for me, this very strange sort of moment in the history of thought where we have this man who comes so close imaginatively to the
mm,
experience and writes about it so much. I have, not mastered all of the scholarship on Nietzsche, but most of what I read is this is not something that's emphasized when people write about him. They write about very different things.
mm,
But this is a very strong theme in his work. And even, again, like the eternal return, this is
mm,
about birth. Um, and so I had him there partly to understand, how the traditions I was also heir to had become more death focused on than
mm,
birth focused, which isn't to say they're not birth focused at all, but I think death is more central. So it was partly to understand that. It was also to kind of work through some of questions about gender.
mm,
It was also um, a way to think through, I'd done a lot of research on ancient Greek materials, but I just felt like eventually I didn't quite have a handle on them. And part of what Nietzsche does is go back to a lot of those Greek materials and Greek creation stories and Dionysus and fertility gods. And, um, so it was a way of kind of drawing in that material without having the book span, 2,500 years. And to see that as, still stuff that's a part of our culture and that we're still kind of
mm,
working through. Um,
mm. Yes.
yeah.
Yes, well, he is a vital thinker, both in the sense of an important thinker for the history of philosophy, but also a thinker who thinks a lot about vitality and
Mm.
life and birth. And I think even, and I think I actually even have this in my book, even the genealogy of morals has the idea of kind of a lineage of birth ideas that are given birth to and then kind of continue in a chain um, that he talks about and upheaves and does many other things with. Um,
Yeah, I think this was an aspect there at Zarathustra. He's,
mm,
it's the great fear is being the of not crossing over, of not being
mm,
that bridge. He sees humans as ultimately as these kind of bridges between
mm,
generations. And
mm,
I think part of, what again he's wrestling with there is knowing that the Nietzsche family line was going to end with him. He was the only
mm,
son in his family. And but also kind of I think seeing some of the pessimism about human life that was infiltrating the culture and that would,
mm.
continue to grow in our own era.
Well, I'd love to hear about your experience of writing this book as someone whose kind of main vocation most of the time is editing. You are, of course, the senior executive editor at Yale University Press. So, what was it like? I've heard some editors describe their kind of job as being a midwife to books. So, what was it like being the one giving birth to the book?
Yeah, it was a big change. You will say it was hard, to do this while working full time, and this is part of why it took me so long to write it. Um, I also think that, some of my approaches in the book I see as, based on instincts I honed as an editor,
Mm,
which are slightly different than I think the training you would get in a PhD program, for instance, where it really is very much about just develop your argument, and in certain schools, kind of slay the opponents. And I think that my training is really to to draw on other voices, to showcase them, to gather them together. When you're
mm,
creating a list of books, you're working with very different viewpoints, very different personalities, and trying to create a place where they all kind of are held together very loosely, and there's all kinds of potential dissonance, but also harmonies that can happen, and intersections, but also divergences. And I think this was important for me. I don't know that I explicitly realized I was doing this as I was writing the book, but I think it was kind of subconscious. But the book is really about the experience of human plurality, and so I think I was really trying to kind of nurture a chorus.
mm,
And, I think part of why birth is hard for us is that it is, it just violates our sense of self and other, that there's a clean boundary between those things. And to really wrap our heads around it, we have to see how, the self always exists in relation, and um, is dependent on other people. And um, that when we're talking about birth, we are talking about plurality. And so, yeah, I think the book tries to kind of hold that together. I think that birth is also that experience of holding other
mm,
people. Um, and so I feel like in many ways my editorial work um, really played a part in my methods, maybe more than anything else. I think it also just helped me see things that I might not have seen. I think it also made I didn't see it meant I didn't see things that I maybe should have seen, that if you were on a kind of training in a certain curriculum, and you would know to read these, 10 people or whatever. Um, but in some ways my methods were a little bit more haphazard, just because kind of all day I have all different kinds of things flying at me. And
mm,
so I was encountering ideas and people and thinkers and histories that I might not have if I was just kind of pursuing my own course of study.
mm,
um, and again, I think there were probably omissions that if I had kind of done this within more of a kind of with more support, more academic support with advisors and colleagues and all of those sorts of things, I think there would have been things I found much sooner. Um, so yeah, but that's how I did it. 'Cause that was sort of my situation, and yeah.
No, it was I love that idea of having kind of nurtured a chorus. And I think the book does that well of putting the voices into conversation um and kind of putting the voices into conversation and also bringing this question of natality into more conversations. And on that note, how would you hope this book will kind of move other conversations forwards? What kind of questions do you hope people will ask about natality that they haven't been asking yet? Not just your book, but as it kind of moves forward into the future.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, part of what I hope that it will do is just inspire conversations about birth and give us a
Mm,
framework to hold those conversations. Natality is, you know, I have my own personal birth story, but then, natality is the part of the human condition. So it's a way of
mm,
kind of connecting our individual life experiences. Birth is often thought about in very isolated ways, as a singular event. But to kind of cast that onto a wider tapestry and to think of these things
mm,
as just interwoven into our being. So I do hope that, it will provide that framework for more conversations to take place. Um, I also think they have to be real conversations. They have to look at all of it. I feel like, our public conversations about the topic are so polarized. They're
mm,
so politicized. They're really about uh, kind of more about advocacy, perhaps, or they've been overtaken by certain kinds of language about advocacy without some of the work of actually thinking through the subject very deeply, and then of course arriving at positions and stances and politics and all of those things. So it's not to say that those aren't part of our shouldn't be part of our conversations about birth. Um, but I feel like a lot of the conversations about birth aren't really real. I think that,
mm,
both the kind of highly sentimentalized versions we sometimes get, the kind of cheerleader versions, that really don't look at the range of experiences people have had and think, that's actually birth too. That might have not been my experience, or that may not be the way I think this should go, but this actually is the way it's gone for a lot of people. To actually listen to those and to take those in and say like these are real, um, but also to not just sort of reject the experience and say, oh, it's like full of problems and we don't want anything to do with it. Like these are some of the biggest questions about our lives, and certainly the most significant experience we've all been through, in the sense that our whole life is contingent upon it. It's also what's going on in the world around us, and
mm,
people are being born all the time, and like we should care about that. That's
mm,
important. We
mm,
have to think about those people. We have to um, just to kind of say that birth is, has these problems, so this is a third rail and we're not going to go anywhere near it, seems to me very problematic.
mm. Yes, and I think your book does a beautiful job of bringing it down to kind of that existential question of birth, that it's something that we really do experience, really does shape our lives, and that just because it doesn't easily fit into some kind of box or match between everyone doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it, because it is this kind of majestic and important thing. I remember after one of my dear friends had her first baby, she said, I can't believe that all these people walk around in the world having experience, but I just experienced, and kind of acting like it's normal.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that your book kind of honors that feeling of incredulity, of the significance of birth. And something I often like to end my conversations with is, and I have one in my mind, so if you need to think about it for a second, you can think about it. But is if there are any works of art or poetry, or music that have to do with birth that you find particularly meaningful or that you would like to point people towards? Does one come to the top of your head, or shall I share mine first?
One does come to the top of my head. And again, I'm sorry to play editor here, but it's because I've just finished editing his work, and it's Makoto Fujimura's
Mm,
work. I published his book, Art and Faith, and now I've just been editing this book, Journey into the Light. And it's interesting to see him work through so much of what I went through or worked
mm,
through in the book, but purely or at least mostly from the perspective of making art and painting in
mm,
particular. Um, and to, basically to edit that book and to be inside that book and to really spend time with him. This book I just edited. The subtitle is, I think, something like Into the Studio, or it's a lot about his art making and the actual studio where he does his work and kind of bringing you inside of that. Um, to be there is to feel and to experience, I think, the dimensions of birth that Arendt was talking about, that many
mm,
other of the people in the book were thinking through. It's that sense that, oh, we can do this. Like,
mm,
this is all just material, like our lives are raw materials, and we can do things with them. We can
mm,
be creative, we can act. And for Mako, this is, there's a whole theology he has about this as divine work, as
mm,
kind of participating in creation. Um, so that's the one that comes first to mind. But I have to say, I'm listening right now to just a lot of music that doesn't talk about birth at all, but I am feeling um, that the what I'm hearing in this music is very much what I was trying to work through in the book. And a
mm,
lot of it is from younger musicians in their 20s, late 20s. A number of them have kind of achieved success a little bit later, so they weren't like teen prodigy stars. And they write a lot about tragedy. So a lot of them are coming out of kind of poor backgrounds. There's a lot of history of drug addiction, substance abuse, poverty. Um, but I have to say, I haven't been so happy in a while. This music is really about taking these histories, of very often forgotten places. A lot of it's like coming out of Appalachia,
mm,
um, and turning it into art. And it's just, I mean, there's a creative joy that I sense in these
mm,
artists. And that is just really, I think, resonating with a whole generations, or with kind of people of different generations, but definitely even my children are listening to this kind of music.
mm,
And that speaks to it. I mean, Arendt would talk about, we need that next generation. They
mhm,
are the ones who renew the world. And I hear it when I listen to that music.
mm,
This is Nality. They're doing it.
mm.
And yeah, but I'd love to hear yours too.
So mine is also music, and I think it's the last song on an album by Olafur Arnolds called Unwoven. And it's this Oliver Arnold does this very kind of like atmospheric, beautiful music. But it's music that's overlaid with a narration by a Canadian artist whose name is slipping my mind. But it's just a kind of I think it was a dialogue with her or an interview at some point where she's speaking about her father um, right before he died, speaking about birth from the perspective of a baby, and how in some way how frightening it must be, because babies go from this kind of enclosed place where they naturally receive everything, and then they're born and it's oxygen and it's light and cold, and she talks about
Mhm.
how this must feel frightening and like death, but it's really this moment of birth and of new life. And I just love there it's kind of a magical song. You feel like her narration of it was made for the music. But I love how she articulates the way in which uh, our both actual birth and our own kind of rebirths in life uh, can feel terrifying and like a moment away from death. And that's where these moments of new birth begin. And it's also quite significant because I looked up the history later, but this artist gave that monologue, and then I think less than a year later, kind of very suddenly died from a very serious illness. But to hear her talking about birth and kind of the spiritual symbolism of that, but also kind of the fear of death and those things being very close together. And I think, when I think about my own sister's birth, I always have this kind of there's this wonderful exhilaration and also this sense of terror because birth is this wonderful, terrible thing that is very close to death,
Yeah.
but is not death. So that's a work of art that I just really love that has to do with birth.
Yeah, and in a strange way, I think this is part of Mako's work and the music I'm
Mm,
listening to and this is part of why I think those people like Sojourner Truth who had
mm,
such a close proximity to tragedy, there was something about having to kind of begin again, of not having things and having to
mm,
create one's way out of a situation and to kind of imagine a better world, or it's the same world but a better version of it. um, that I think there just is that connection. And one
mm,
of my favorite reviews of my book, was I think right in saying that, my goal is not to overtake death or for like birth to dominate or anything like that. It's actually to say these are both experiences that are very often deeply
mm,
interwound. I mean, through a lot
mm,
of the history of birth, there was a very high probability of death, either of the mother or the child, and that's still
mm.
there for many communities and parts of the world. But it's still birth, and it still is the creation of new life. And yeah, we can't take these things apart. Exist
Yep.
together, and they are the bookends of our lives.
They are the bookends of our life. And as you put so beautifully, the very condition for these lives of possibility and agency that we live. So,
Mhm.
thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. It's been so lovely, and I will direct everyone to read your book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great conversation. I'm so grateful for your time.